Alright guys, welcome back. Today we start assembly. So one of the first things I want to do for Project Wide Fox is to put the new clutch kit in and get the bell housing back on the engine before I put it in the car. So what you see behind is my small block Ford that I took out of the 92 that's going in the 1980 Project Wide Fox. So one of the first things I'm going to do is get the old pilot bearing out. Even though it's still good, I'm going to put a new one in because I have a brand new clutch kit that I bought. It's an Exedy brand. It's got all the pieces to it. We're going to go through step by step and show you how to put it all in, assuming you've already got it out. Now, in order to get the pilot bushing or the pilot bearing out of the back of the crankshaft, I would recommend trying to use a pilot bushing or bearing puller. Now you can see on the internet where guys are using a few pieces of bread and they're stuffing it through the middle with a socket and it's pushing it out. I really don't want to get that messy, so I went and bought an actual puller for it. Now the pilot bushing itself is a 3/4 diameter, so just make sure that this pilot bearing puller that you buy can go down to a 3/4 inch in order to get on the inside of that. Okay, so how a pilot bearing or pilot bushing, depending on what you call it, works. The puller itself has 3 teeth, so you can see the 3 teeth are now going down in the center there. Now this one actually had a little bit of casting flash on here, so I just ground down the teeth a little bit just to be able to make sure they went in and they could expand out. There's a threaded piece in here that puts pressure on this, which pushes them, expanding them out, and that's just controlled by this handle. So turning this in drives this in, expanding those teeth out. Now you can see that there's this crossbar here, and these legs push basically on the back of the crankshaft and use that to pull the bearing out. Now you tighten this down all the way until these touch, and when you turn this nut here, what it's going to do is try to pull this and put pressure on these bars against the crankshaft. Now with that explanation, let's get this bearing out of there. Okay, so I ended up taking this out. Now this came out in 2 pieces, so obviously the inner here and the outer there. The outer honestly was a mother chicken because the tool wouldn't grip it, so I ended up just basically cutting a slice out of it. That way it just relieved the pressure off of it, and then I could use the tool to pull it out. Now the reason to not use cheap tools is because within 12 seconds of using this, I snapped the leg off. So guess I'll be taking this back, but it at least worked. How about that? So I got it to work, but it did snap a leg off, so I need to take that back. Now in order to put this new pilot bushing or pilot bearing back in, you can then just kind of take it, once you cleaned everything out, take it and locate it in. Now this is going to be a press fit, so it's nice and tight to put in. You can try put it in the freezer if you want to try and get it to shrink. But once you get it in square, what you'll then do is just take a socket. Now this is a 15/16 deep well. You can see it fits nicely over the inside, but then will sit against the outside. And just take this, and then you're going to hammer and drive this in until it fits in there. So once it's all the way tapped in, you'll notice that it's going to sit below this outside ring there. So it's going to sit under that, and it needs to be roughly flush down in here. So when you kind of tap in, you'll hear it go ting, 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 and then it will change to like a ting, 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 ting. And that which means it's that the inside is now contacting the crankshaft, and you're driving it in. So you can give it a couple more light taps just to make sure it fits, and then we'll move on to the flywheel. Okay, so before you get to your flywheel, make sure that if you have a manual transmission, you're going to put on your plate that goes in the back. Now this is an aluminum plate that comes into it, goes behind your flywheel, and on this there are 2 holes on the dowel pins that go in. Now if you think you might have this backwards or not, you try to flip it around. It actually will go on the dowel pins, but doesn't fit on the crankshaft. So you've got this hole over here on the side. This is where your starter goes, which is on the passenger side. So thankfully, they made it smarter than me, and I can only put it on one way. Now, as you go to put your flywheel on, Make sure that the surface of the crankshaft is clean on the backside. That way it doesn't caulk it for any reason. If there's any kind of metal shavings, dirt, anything like that in there, clean it off, because cleanliness is going to make you do this very well. Now, you can see by the shininess of my flywheel, I've already had this turned and surfaced. If you remember back when I first took everything off, gosh, what, like a year and a half ago, it had some really good heat pockets on it where it had been, the clutch was almost wore out. So I'm glad I took it all apart. So mine's already been resurfaced, and I'll need to clean this when I'm finished. Now to put it in, what I've done is just put in 2 of the original flex plate bolts here. And I'm going to put in the other 4 before I go back and finish these other 2. Now these go in, use a little bit of red Loctite on these to make sure that these do not back out for any reason, because the last thing you want is a flywheel coming off. And then always check either an owner's manual, service manual, or something. Make sure that once you put these on, you torque them in a cross pattern. So obviously like a 6-star pattern there, because it's 6 bolts. Snug them down and then make sure they're torqued with a calibrated torque wrench in order to get them secure. Okay, now with the flywheel put on and torqued, the bolts on the V8 go to 80 foot-pounds. So that is enough, honestly, to turn the crankshaft. So since I don't want to use an impact because it's not calibrated and I don't know if I'm going to 100, 120, 60, etc., I'm going to put these on my hand. So now I use a torque wrench to 80 foot-pounds in the star pattern. And in order to stop this from turning, if you notice I have the bolts in here. Now these are for the bell housing and that, so I put them around just to keep this in place, this plate. But at the same time, you can take just basically a torque tool, or you can take a pry bar, basically. A pry bar in the tooth of the ring gear, or the flywheel, and use that to pry against one of these bolts. Now make sure the bolt's in tight enough that the threads are in there and it gives it good stability for this travel. But you can then put this in the teeth, pull there, and lift up on the piece, the pry bar, and then push down as a counteract to tighten these bolts. Now when you get one tight, make sure you mark it, because you don't want to have to keep tightening the same one over and over because you forget which one it is. So mark it, move on to the one diagonal, and then just keep going in a 6-point star until you're done. Okay, so once you have everything cleaned with some brake cleaner to make sure there's no greasy fingerprints on your flywheel, you can grab your clutch disc. So now your clutch disc itself is going to have 2 sides. You can see one side kind of has a protrusion with the springs in it. The other side is straight, almost flat. The flat side is going to go towards the flywheel. So it should come with a dowel, and it's most likely just an injection molded plastic piece, but it'll be splined, so it'll go in your disc, and then that will go into your pilot bearing, and then you can push until your disc is all the way on. Now this will keep everything aligned to the center of the crankshaft, and now you can go get your pressure plate to go on. Now to put on the pressure plate, you need to align the pressure plate with the 3 dowel pins that are in the flywheel. It'll line up there, and it's going to be a tight fit, so be patient with it, and it'll fit on there very nicely. Once you have it set on there roughly close, you can then start to put in your bolts and just kind of back and forth like a star, because there's going to be 6 of those. So a 6-point star, and just tighten them all the way down until the plate of the pressure plate touches the flywheel. Once there, they'll be snug, and then you can go back and take them back out one at a time. Use some blue. Now this is blue Loctite versus red. Blue is removable, and the pressure plate itself is removable. You want it to be able to be removed, versus red, which is more of like crankshaft stuff that if it comes apart, it's really bad. Blue is okay. It'll keep coming back off. Flywheel, you might not have to take it back off or not. So take these out one by one, similar to what you did with the flex plate or the flywheel going on the crankshaft. And then once you tighten those down, they're going to be about 20 foot-pounds. Just do the same thing. 6-point star, cross, and then mark them as you go, and that way you know I'm done with that one. Okay, so the last piece to go in after you put on your pressure plate is going to be the bell housing and the clutch release fork. So the bell housing itself, is going to have 2 dowels that go over the back of it. and it'll have bolts. You need to put in your clutch fork here. Now remember, you've got the dowel in here that it's going to slide over, so it needs to be greased before you put it in. And then it'll attach here on the bottom, and then it will go in this way and then snap in. Once you do that, you can then take your throw-out bearing here, or your clutch release bearing, and then it's going to go all the way in and then over the prongs and then snap in. And once that's in there, this is where your input shaft is going to come through and attach to the clutch and go into the pilot bushing or bearing on the back. So let me get this greased up, and then we'll go ahead and throw this back on the engine. Okay, once everything's greased and ready to go, it's time to throw the bell housing on. So now as you set it up in here, you'll line it first with your 2 dowels on the back, and then you can start putting in your bolts. Now on the top 2 bolts up here, these are going to be shorter than the pieces here. And that's, if you look at the casting on the bell housing, they're going to be thinner than the pieces. So you'll get 2 smaller ones up top. The 2 sides get 2 longer ones. They're going to have basically a head like this where it's not flared out. And then on the very bottom, you'll get the 2 smaller screws like that hold the plate to the bell housing. Now, in order to attach the bell housing, you can use some blue Loctite on those, because those you will need to come back off eventually if you replace the clutch. But once you secure those down properly using a torque wrench, the bell housing is on. Now, in order to put the transmission on, you're going to want to put on some high temp grease, just a little bit to give it a little bit of in-out smooth operation. Don't put on too much, because remember, it's going to be spinning, so any extra you put on is going to be flung out into your clutch, and you don't need any extra of that. When you do the alignment of the splines, you can turn them there or put it in gear and turn the end of the shaft if you can get to it. But make sure they line up, and take it easy and patient, and it'll slide right in there, and then you can bolt it up and be done. So at that point, you can put on the starter, anything else you've taken off because of taking this out, and the job is done. So with that, I'll close for today, but if you have any questions on how to do this for your Mustang or any vehicle you're looking at, let me know. Otherwise, see you next time.